we can also use cosine law to solve for a missing angle. So this is the final method that you will try to solve for an angle in a non-right triangle. So as discussed in the previous lesson, if you have an opposite pair in your triangle, then you will use sine law because it's easier. However, we don't always have that. So we can use cosine law to solve for an angle measure. And the information that we need in order to do that is all three side lengths. Okay, so that would mean that if we don't have an opposite pair, we don't know any of the angles. Okay, so all three sides are what we need to know. And instead of SAS, like we talked about with solving for a side length, that means we've got SSS. Okay, so that is side, side, side. Okay, so if you see a triangle and you say, okay, I have all three side lengths, that's your sign that you are going to use cosine law. Okay, so for example, if I have a triangle like this, and I know maybe this, 7, 8, 5, for example, if I have all three sides, I can use cosine law. The formula is the exact same as the one that we use to solve for a side. The only difference is we just have to do a little bit of rearranging. Okay, so what is different about this is the unknown is on the right side of the equation. So we need to isolate. Right, so with solving for the side length, our unknown was on the left side, and we just had to calculate everything as it was written on the right side. So in this case, we just have to do a bit of isolating. Our last step is going to always be the same, and we'll see in the example here, but the last step is going to be doing the inverse cosine, because what you'll see when we rearrange, we will end up with like cosine b, let's say, is equal to, and then a decimal number. So our last step needs to be doing the inverse cosine to get the actual angle measured. Okay. Now, something to keep in mind that's very important is you always need to find the biggest angle first if you're using cosine to find an angle. So I will try to not give you questions where this will become an issue, just because it's hard to remember, but it's something that you'll look further into in grade 11. So you must find the biggest angle first. Okay, you can usually tell which one is the biggest angle just visually. However, the diagrams are not always to scale. So you can tell which one the biggest angle is because it's opposite of the longest side. Okay, so that will always be true in any triangle. And because we know all three side lengths, we can tell which one is the longest, and the largest angle will be opposite of that. Okay, so if we look at an example here, I'm going to determine the value of angle Z. So when you see this triangle, you might panic. It's not labeled ABC, it's labeled XYZ. That's fine. You can leave it like that if you don't mind writing the formula out using different letters. However, what I find most students prefer to do is to just, on the diagram, just cross off X, Y, Z and replace them with ABC, okay? It doesn't change anything by doing that other than making it easier for you to see what's happening. So it doesn't really matter which you replace where. I'm just gonna call this A, B, C. I guess technically I should have gone counterclockwise, but again, doesn't really matter. So if the angle on top is A, that means this side is going to be side A, side B will be here, the 9-foot side, and side C is going to be my 6-foot side. Okay, so again, you can either just rewrite the formula using X, Y, and Z, or there's no harm in just crossing them off and making them A, B, C for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so I want to find angle Z, so really that's angle B, right, that I'm looking for, which is this right here. So looking at the triangle, we can tell it's obviously not a right triangle because there's no 90-degree angle indicated. I don't have an opposite pair, right? I don't know any of the angles. However, I do have side, side, side. So that's what tells me I'm going to use cosine law. Okay, and the way I decide which iteration of the formula to use is based on which angle I'm trying to find. Okay, you might recall when you were first introduced to the formula, the cosine at the end of the equation is either cosine of A, B, or C, and it corresponds with the letter that's on the left side of the equation, right? So we had A squared equals B squared equals C squared equals. So because I'm trying to find angle B, I'm going to use the B squared formula, okay? On the test, I usually will only give you one iteration of it just to save space. In that case, like let's say for angle Z here, you could call that A so that it's always set up using the letter of the formula that I will give you. However, you will have access to the other formulas as well when you're completing things. So side, 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 we're going to use cosine law. So the blank formula I'm using, I'll just write over here, is B squared equals A squared plus C squared, subtract 2 times A times C times cosine of B. Okay, so that's why we need to use the B squared formula, because I'm trying to find angle B right here, and that variable needs to be in my equation to be able to solve for it. So the difference here now is when I sub in the values that I know, they're going to be all of my little letters. Okay, we'll go away. So B squared, B is 9, A is 8, C is 6, and then I have subtract 2 times 8 times 6 times cos of B. Okay, so the only unknown that's left here is B, capital B, which is the angle B, because again, that's what I'm trying to solve. So I'm going to go through and calculate this. Again, I'm going to show more steps here than what I usually do. So as you practice, you'll kind of see what makes most sense to you. You can show all the steps if you want to. If you're able to skip a few and still get the correct answer, that's fine as well. So 9 squared, 9 times 9 is 81. 8 squared is 64. And 6 squared is 36. Okay, then I'm going to keep this as a subtraction sign. Okay, I don't type that in when I'm calculating, like I don't type it as negative 2 times 8 times 6. I just do positive 2 times 8 times 6, which will give me 96, and that's multiplied by cosine of B. Okay, and again, you'll see why I do that in a moment. It's just, I don't know, it just makes it easier to not confuse the signs here. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add these together. I'm not subtracting 96 because it's attached to the cosine of B through multiplication. Okay, so this side is still 81. 64 plus 36 is 100. And this just stays as 96 times cosine of B. Okay, so now I need to undo everything that's happening to B so that I can isolate it, right? So right now, B has the cosine function being applied to it, then it's being multiplied by 96, then it's being subtracted from 100. So that's how you would solve in BEDMAS order, but to isolate, we're going to go reverse BEDMAS. So the first thing we're going to do always is we're subtracting whatever the first number here is. In this case, it's 100, and we will subtract it from this side as well. Okay, so that will get rid of that number on the right side of your equation. It's okay that the left side now is negative. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive, and again, that just kind of corresponds to what your angle is, whether it's going to be obtuse, bigger than 90, or acute, smaller than 90. So we have negative 19 equals, and then this is still negative here. Okay, we keep the negative. The right side, when we subtract the first number there from both sides, what's left on the right side will always be negative and then a number times your cosine. Okay, so then we want to get rid of that negative 96 that's being multiplied by our cosine, right? That's the next step to isolate. So we're dividing by negative 96. Okay, that will cancel this out. And that means on this side, we also need to divide by negative 96. Okay, so this is where sometimes it's a bit different. So negative 19 divided by negative 96 is going to give you a positive answer. Okay, make sure when you see that negative divided by negative is a positive. Sometimes the answer that you have there, like when we did this step and subtracted, sometimes this will be a positive, so you'll have positive divided by negative is a negative. Just make sure you're typing it in correctly on your calculator or that you're paying close attention to the signs and what's happening there. So if we do that, we get positive 0.1979. Again, I'm keeping the whole number on my calculator, but I'm just going to write it to 4 decimal places. And that is equal to the cosine of b. I don't want the cosine of b, I want the actual angle measure of b, so I need to do the inverse cosine on both sides. Again, you don't need to write like the inverse cosine of the right side here. Typically what I'll do is I'll just switch this to this side here, b equals, and I'm doing the inverse cosine of that decimal number. Okay, so that's usually how I show that. And again, make sure you know how to type that on your calculator. It's an angle, so we are rounding to the nearest whole number. So you get, before rounding, you get 78.584, whatever. So we are going to say B is equal to 79 degrees. Okay, again, our unit for an angle is always degrees. And that is our final answer. Now, I want to show one more example in case you are curious what happens if the angle ends up being obtuse. Okay, so in this case, the angle is 79 degrees. It's smaller than 90 degrees, so, you know, it ended up working out fine. We didn't necessarily have to worry about it being the biggest angle, and you'll notice that here the decimal that we calculated was a positive. So if I were to draw a different triangle, let's say I've got this triangle ABC, like this. And I'm not told specifically which angle to solve for. Let's say maybe I just want to solve the whole triangle, meaning that I will end up finding all of the angles. If I'm looking at this, I have side, side, side. Okay, so I know I'm going to use cosine law, but it does make a difference which angle I find first, okay, if I'm just being told to solve the whole triangle. And I need to find the biggest angle first, which is this one. Okay, again, visually we can tell that it's the biggest one, but it's also across from the longest side, right? The longest side is clearly 25, right? That's the biggest number there. And the angle across from that is C. So I have to find this first because it is the biggest. Okay, so I'm going to label my sides quickly. So again, labeling them opposite to the vertice. So this is side A, this is side B, this is side C. And because I want to find angle C, I'm going to use the C version of my formula. Okay, so I'm going to do C squared equals A squared plus B squared minus 2 times A times B times the cosine of C. I like to write the blank formula just because, especially with these ones where the letters switch spots a lot, you make sure you're putting everything in the right spot. Okay, then I'm going to fill in what I know. So 25 squared equals 12 squared plus 18 squared. Subtract 2 times 12 times 18 times cosine of C. And I'm now going through and calculating, following the same order of steps that I did in the previous example. Okay, so 25 squared is 625. 12 squared is 144. 18 squared is 324. Okay, I keep my subtraction sign here, and then 2 times 12 times 18 is 432. and this is still just cos C. Okay, so only one letter left once we fill in everything that we know. So first, I'm going to add these together. If you want to do that, like those two in one step, that's fine. That's what I typically do on my calculators. I just type 12 squared plus 18 squared. So then I'll have 625 equals 468 minus 432 times cosine of C. My next step is always going to be to subtract whatever this front number is. Again, keeping in mind that I'm not subtracting 432 from that number. Okay, so I will subtract on this side and I get a positive answer. Okay, so this is where it's a little bit different from the previous question. So I have 157 is equal to, and then I just have negative 432 times cosine of C left on this side. Okay, so then following the same steps, I'm going to divide by negative 432 because that will cancel this out. Okay, it has to be a negative that you're dividing by in order to be correct. And then I'm also dividing this side by negative 432. So you'll notice what happens here now is I am dividing a positive number by a negative number. So my decimal that I get here is going to be negative, and that's okay. You don't need to change it to a positive because you think it looks weird. It's supposed to be negative. Okay, so we have negative 0.3634 is equal to cosine of C. And what this tells us, because the decimal is a negative value, this tells us that when we solve for the actual angle, it's going to be obtuse. It will be bigger than 90 degrees. Okay, so then the last step here, I need to take the inverse cosine of both sides so that I can isolate for just C, my angle measure. So I'll have C is the inverse cosine of negative 0.3634. Okay, if you're just keeping the number on your calculator and then doing the inverse cosine, it's fine. It won't really make a difference. But if you're going to clear your calculator and type the number back in, make sure you put that negative. Okay, so we'll do the inverse cosine of that number. You get 111.31, whatever. Again, it's just rounded to the nearest whole number because it is an angle measure. So that means that angle C is 111 degrees. Okay, so those are the two types of scenarios that you will encounter when using cosine law to solve for an angle measure. And you now have all of the strategies that you need to solve for an angle or a side length in any type of triangle.